June 24th, 2022 is a date that is going to be cemented into the minds of pro-life activists and activists on both sides of the abortion wars for decades to come. Because as we all know, it's the day Roe v. Wade was overturned, in Mike Pence's words, thrown into the ash heap of history. At the court, I was there, yours truly was there, along with the pro-life generation. We were surrounded by those crying and jumping, just joy for the ruling. But just a few feet away from us was utter devastation of those who support abortion. But June 24th, 2022 didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't like this fluke that just happened. It was the result of nearly 5 decades of activism on both sides of the abortion debate. One side would seem to overtake the other and score a point, whether it was, with a political victory or an election. But then the other side would seem to gain cultural ground, the invention of the 4D ultrasound comes to mind. It kind of went back and forth for decades. And a lot of folks didn't know how the justices were going to decide, or even if they were going to pick up an abortion case. But everything changed on June 24th. Today's guest on the Explicitly Pro-Life podcast is one of the most diligent chroniclers of history leading up to that date. And I'm sitting down with her to get her take on where we go from here, how we got to this point, and where she expects the trajectory of the pro-life and pro-abortion movements to go in the coming weeks and months.
Hey guys, this is Autumn Higashi, Students for Life spokesperson, jumping on Explicitly Pro-Life to let you know about a very special event coming up that we need you to join. This Valentine's Day, we are asking the Walgreens CEO to love them both, the mother and the child, and to stop distributing chemical abortion pills. Women and children deserve better than these deadly abortion drugs that are responsible for the deaths of nearly 30 women and millions of preborn babies. So, I'm asking you to please visit studentsforlife.org/abortion cartel to get more information about joining our February 14th protest online or in person, and see about hosting your own local pharmacy protest on March 4th. We cannot let our pharmacies become abortion facilities. Thank you.
Hey, Pro-Life Gen, I'm Kristan Hawkins. Welcome to this very special episode of the Explicitly Pro-Life podcast. My guest today is Mary Ziegler. If you've never met Mary Ziegler at a pro-life function, I wouldn't expect you to. Mary is not a pro-life activist. She is a law professor. She's a Martin Luther King Jr. professor of law at the University of California, Davis. She is one of the world's leading historians on the U.S. struggle over abortion. She has written 5 books on the subject, including the award-winning After Roe, The Lost History of the Abortion Debate. She is a curator of a major exhibit on the history of Roe that is going to be debuting at Harvard in a couple months. I had a sneak peek of it a couple weeks ago, and it was fascinating. She often, you'll see her quoted, and she's consulted with leading media outlets, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post. Anytime there is a question about the history or current events and how we got to this part of the pro-life, pro-abortion struggle. I am so honored to have you here today, Mary, with me. Thanks for coming on to Explicitly Pro-Life.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I was telling you before we started, I don't know if everyone who listens to Explicitly Pro-Life is going to hear the name Mary Ziegler and be like, I know that name, but they all should, because, you are not a pro-life advocate, like most of the guests on the show. I guess I would classify you as pro-legal abortion. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm probably, I think that's fair. I mean, although I'm probably not really an advocate either. I mean, I'm a historian, so probably my most uncomfortable public moment, I was doing an event at the National Constitution Center with Catherine Glenn Foster from AUL and Kitty Colbert. And at one point, and I was there to be like the straight person, like the person who gave historical context. And at one point, someone from the audience is like, well, what do you think should happen? And I'm like, well, why are you asking me that? So most of the time, that's not what I think about. But yeah, that's probably a fair characterization.
Yeah. And I think that is why, Mary, I have so much respect for what you do. And I really, listen up when you talk through the news articles. About what you have to say about the pro-life movement or the fight over abortion in the United States, because I do think in terms of fairness and the books that I've read of yours and the articles you've written, I do think you try to be very fair to both sides, and you really do objectively see that role of a historian and chronicler for this movement. And I think that is so, so important. I was reading one of your books just recently on the plane, and I found myself going, yep, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I think it's so great that, it's weird because I feel like I've gotten like firsthand for some of this history because I know these folks and I've worked alongside them. And then you're quoting like things that they've said in speeches, or you're kind of one removed away from these folks. So, I'm like I said, I was fangirling a little bit about having you on the podcast because I think it's so important to have these discussions. And especially to have someone who's just so well versed in the history of the abortion movement. I think you have a lot you can teach many of us who are listening.
Thanks.
Okay, so I have questions for you, as you can imagine. I have a lot of questions, and if you have questions for me, go for it. I don't want to make it a one-sided conversation, but what struck me was I was at the library where you're curating this major exhibit on abortion. I think it comes out in March. Is that right?
It's actually on display now, actually. So you can see parts of it online, which is cool. But I would recommend actually going to the exhibit because one, there's some audio visual aspects. We have letters from folks who had abortions, but who'd had, some people who had good experiences, some people who were looking to have abortions, some people who had bad experiences, and those are read at the library. You can see them and see pictures of the insides of abortion clinics. And I think that's really like, it's not the same experience to see that online, but it's on display now at Harvard through March. And there's a big conference at Harvard that will have some pro-life and pro-choice folks, big names attending in January and on what would have been the 50th of Roe.
Oh, that's awesome. Where can folks get more information about the conference and the display?
So you can register if you go to, it's being hosted by the Radcliffe Institute. So if you go to the Radcliffe Institute page, there is, and I can give you a link eventually too, but there's a link where you can register for the conference now. And you should also be able to find, if people can't travel to Boston for the exhibit, there's a lot of the images and information about the exhibit. You can kind of do a virtual tour online, and that's available at the Radcliffe website too.
As Kristan is typing that into her to-do box. Okay, that's exciting. Yeah, so when I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I kind of got a sneak peek while they were setting up the display, and I was waiting for the meeting to begin. One of the things that I was struck by was I was speaking with one of the archivists there at the library, and I got the sense that she wasn't really with me on this issue. But she said something that was really funny to me and striking of that, a lot of folks were so astonished by Roe versus Wade being reversed, just completely for them came out of the middle of nowhere. But she said, obviously they haven't been reading what we've been reading because we could tell you how we got to this point. Does that statement resonate with you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's always, whenever it's the Supreme Court, there's always like a degree of randomness involved, right? So, I mean, if Donald Trump didn't win in 2016 or like Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died earlier or, there are a lot of sort of coincidences that needed to happen. But, having said that, there were definitely a lot of changes that were a long time coming that produced the decision. So, I mean, as much as those coincidences needed to happen, if these kind of broader shifts had not taken place in the 5 decades before Dobbs, it wouldn't have happened anyway. So in that sense, it wasn't surprising to me in that way, right? So I mean, I guess it was both surprising and not surprising, just because those coincidences needed to take place. But I was definitely a lot of people had been working for that moment for a long time, and in ways that just go beyond, what you would usually think of, which is, like people making pro-life arguments in court or making pro-life arguments at rallies. Like I think the work was more complicated than that in terms of, changing how the Republican Party operates, changing how campaign finance works, changing how, even Republican conventions operate. Like there were lots of sort of changes that I think were more almost structural, like changing how the GOP approached Supreme Court confirmations. A lot of that, I think, had to happen too, or you wouldn't have had the outcome we saw last June.
What do you think were the biggest factors? Was it people or groups, social forces, or these, structural institution changes that in your mind people need to kind of take, account of what happened when looking at how we got to a point where Roe versus Wade was reversed?
I mean, I think there was a lot of both. I mean, I think obviously the pro-life movement of 2022, which is complicated and very different in some ways than I think the pro-life movement of, say, like 2018 even, is also very different than the movement of like the 60s or 70s. And so I think what the movement does and is has changed in ways that I think were really important in terms of, the size of the pro-life movement, where the pro-life movement primarily is powerful, right? I mean, if you took a time machine to like 1970 and said, okay, tell me, where do you think, which states have the strongest pro-life organizing? You would have said like New York and Pennsylvania, right? And now if I asked you that question, that would not be your answer probably, right? You would probably think of states like, like Mississippi or Alabama, right? States that often rank very high on kind of lists of pro-life legislation. That's been, I think, a significant change. The fact that the pro-life movement is partnering with the Republican Party, like that's the fact that happened wasn't inevitable. And then once it happened, I think for a long time, if you asked historians, they would say basically in this relationship between the pro-life movement and the Republican Party is basically like the shot caller, and the pro-life movement is just basically there to like take whatever crumbs, the Republican Party wants to give them. And I mean, if you ask somebody now, that is very much not the picture they would have. So I think that dynamic changed, and those structural changes were really important. So I think the pro-life movement becoming a bigger, more national movement, but also I think a movement that is more regionally concentrated in different ways than it was pre-Roe, that all mattered. And then I think these structural changes matter too, because, is the Supreme Court responsive to grassroots movements or popular opinion? I mean, I think yes and no, but the Supreme Court is obviously also responsive to changes to like who's sitting on the Supreme Court, how the party that put those people there is thinking about the court. So I think all of those kinds of less glamorous, like structural changes were really important and sometimes like underestimated.
What were some of those less glamorous ones? I was reading one of your latest books about campaign finance reform. Can you explain that to Gen Z of what that means and what it matters?
Yeah, well, so campaign finance laws generally dictate like how you can spend your money on elections, right? So how much can you give to a candidate? How much can you give to like a PAC? How much can you give to like a nonprofit organization that's going to either do lobbying or advocacy for candidates? And there's lots of laws on campaign finance dating all the way really even way back, like the early 20th century. But a lot of the biggest ones emerged in the post, Watergate era when folks were really concerned about corruption. And I think by the time you got to the 90s, there were a lot of pro-life groups that were worrying that campaign finance limits were hobbling, pro-life groups, basically. They thought they were favoring the mainstream media and generally hurting grassroots groups. And I mean, it's worth saying they thought they were hurting all grassroots groups, including groups that were pro-choice as well as pro-life. But they then began, like the National Right to Life Committee, for example, began doing a lot of work to challenge the constitutionality of campaign finance rules, advocating against campaign finance rules, all on the theory that that would help pro-life groups elect more candidates that they liked, but also I think, gain more influence in the Republican Party, right? Not just sort of be the junior partner in the relationship, which had been sort of, I think, to some degree true in years past. So if folks in Gen Z have heard anything about campaign finance, they've probably heard of a case called Citizens United, which is famous for saying that corporations, which include, ideological nonprofit corporations, can spend unlimited amounts in independent expenditures. Citizens United, people don't often realize, began as a case litigated by pro-lifers, right? It wasn't litigated initially by, big business or for-profit corporations or anything like that. It was Citizens United. The lawyer who initially represented Citizens United, Jim Bopp, was general counsel for National Right to Life Committee. So there were other pro-life groups that got involved in this too. And I think that did help change the balance of power in the GOP. Another big structural change is just how I think the pro-life movement and other conservative movements too related to Supreme Court confirmation picks. If you look for decades, essentially, if you were to try to boil down what was the pro-life movement's strategy on Supreme Court confirmations, it was basically get Republicans elected. And that was it, because Republicans were aligned with the movement. They would pick judges who were sympathetic. And eventually it became pretty clear that wasn't going to cut it, because some Republicans were going to pick justices, usually, and I think this is not hard to understand, the justices who were going to be the easiest to confirm, because they had some experiences in the past where justices hadn't been confirmed. And that was embarrassing and counterproductive to them. So they wanted to find, people with no paper trails, kind of like stealth candidates and so on. So you began to see over time lots of conservative movements, including the pro-life movement, essentially, fighting with Republican presidents because their picks were not conservative enough. I don't know about conservative may not even be the right word, but they were worried that the picks were not, were the kind of people who would be afraid of a backlash if Roe v. Wade were up for reconsideration. And I think that kind of structural change, so having justices on the court now who I think, obviously are self-identified originalists and textualists and were picked by Republican presidents and I think would identify as conservative. All of that isn't that new, right? We've had justices like that before, but I think there was a deliberate attempt to find people who would stick to those beliefs, even when there was some worry that what they were doing might be unpopular or just that they weren't as concerned about the kind of what lawyers would call institutionalist arguments, right? The idea that what you're doing may make the Supreme Court unpopular or may damage the reputation of the court or may diminish the power of the court. I think there's been a lot of successful work by people in the pro-life movement and other movements to say, essentially, we need to find justices who don't care about that stuff, who are going to do what they think is the right thing, regardless of whether that's going to poll badly or, people are not going to like the court or whatever. And I think that is a big structural change, right? Because it means not just that the court's going to do what it did with Roe, but that it will approach a lot of things differently if it doesn't have those sorts of what is the court's institutional standing or whatever in the back of its mind anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we agree. I think those are two massive changes that most folks don't think about when they think about the abortion wars in our country and the changes and the forces that had to come into play to get us to a complete Roe reversal. I think one of the things I wanted to ask you was, it's so striking to hear you say these things as a historian, because I'm we still have problems today with Republicans who get elected and use all the right words and then fail to do anything, or who've committed to us in the primary that they're 100% with us and get into a debate in a general and back away from their views. And so I think it's very striking that some of these themes are continual challenges for the pro-life movement and where we want to be and where we want to go. What's with the display that you've created at Harvard? What's your goal with that? What's your takeaway that folks, students, or community members who go through the display, whether online or in person, what are you hoping that they walk away feeling?
Well, I think one of the reasons I got into being a historian, I think, was because there was just a lot of information I wanted to know that wasn't available. So I was actually like a second year law student and I was taking legal history. And I was just curious about, the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, because some of the questions in the class were sort of, how do you change the world? Basically, like, can you use law to change the world? And I thought, Brown versus Board of Education was sort of the happy story, maybe, that you can, or maybe not, right? Some historians think that there was less effective than we think. And I thought maybe Roe was going to be the cautionary tale or something like that, but there was just no book about that. And so I think this is an area where there's a lot of heat and not always a lot of light or a lot of information. And so what we wanted people to do was just to sort of experience the history and encounter some of the people who were part of the history, whether they're pro-life or pro-choice, or a lot of the people who, you'll encounter in the exhibit are probably not really either of those things, right? And are just people who've had some experience with abortion or were looking for an abortion or were not, right? And just, I think for people to come away from the exhibit and think that they've learned something they didn't know, and then just to sort of sit with it and think about what they feel, right? I mean, I don't want to tell them what to feel. I think there's, there's a lot of that out there already. And I think, one of the parts of the exhibit I think that's really interesting and is, we have some tools that people used in performing abortions, right? And I had never, as much as I studied this, I'd never actually seen that, right? And so looking at that and seeing what you think, right? Or hearing a letter from someone who'd had an abortion and had a good or bad experience, or someone who was looking for one, just hearing that and seeing what you think. I think that's mostly what we wanted to do, just to give people more information they wouldn't have. And I mean, not necessarily, we're not proselytizing or convincing anyone of anything. We're just sort of saying whatever you think, you should ground it in more information about where we are and how we got here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where do you think, you have this display of how we got here. Where do you think we are going as a country when it comes to abortion? Like where, I don't know, like in 5 years, where do you think we will roughly be, whether, it's a federal law, continued state advancement, state laws, another Supreme Court case? Do you have any thoughts of where you think we're headed with all of this?
I think there's a lot of unpredictability. So one of the reasons there's a lot of unpredictability is if you read, history of debates about abortion going back, you would sort of say there were sort of like a handful of groups that were kind of the power players, right? So you'd say, oh, there's like NARAL and there's Planned Parenthood, and on the pro-life side, you probably focus on like National Right to Life and Americans United for Life. And now I think, there's a lot of different groups on both sides that are trying to shape the course of strategy going forward. And Students for Life is probably one of the most significant, right? There's even kind of questions about if it's going to be national groups at all, or instead, if you're going to have in both, blue and red states, you're going to have state groups that are essentially saying, well, we have our own strategy. Like, we don't need to talk to these national folks. Like, we have our own ideas of what we want to do in our state. And that introduces a lot of uncertainty about what kinds of policies we're going to see emerging in all the states, really, frankly. I think, if I'm being kind of the clearest prediction is that in 5 years, it's not going to be over, right? I think that probably the only part of the Dobbs opinion, there's some sort of moments where, Justice Kavanaugh is like, well, maybe now that like we have this opinion, this whole thing will just sort of decelerate. And I'm really skeptical of that. I think in part because people who are pro-choice are unhappy with Dobbs. And I think people who are pro-life are not done after Dobbs. It's not as if Dobbs made abortion illegal everywhere or recognized the personhood of an unborn child or whatever. Like, it just said the states can now deal with this on their own. So I think because no one is ultimately satisfied with where we are now, the conflict's going to continue. I don't know. I'm skeptical that there will be a single solution at the federal level, whether that's, legislation saying, you get access to abortion, or legislation saying abortion is a crime. Historically, there hasn't been many instances where Congress is the place where a lot of policy on abortion gets made. I mean, that could change, but it would be a really big change. I think if we're likely to see any policy at the federal level, and then, the next 10 years, it'd be more likely from the Supreme Court, maybe saying, abortion is unconstitutional, although I don't see that happening in the next 5 years. I think Brett Kavanaugh was trying pretty hard to, shut that door for the short term, if maybe not forever. If we are back in the courts, I think it's going to be because of fighting between the states, right? Where you have maybe a state like Texas that says, okay, if a person from Texas travels to, California and gets an abortion, we're going to say that that's a crime in the state of Texas, or we're going to allow the doctor in California to be sued. And that would just there's so many complicated legal questions that would raise, which we really haven't encountered in a really long time, that I think you would wind up seeing a lot of fighting in the courts, not directly about, is there a right to abortion or is there a right to life or whatever, but just more about like when states A and state B are fighting, what do we do about it? Because the courts would have to come into that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of that in the next 5 years. But I think a lot of the action is going to be at the state level where it really has been, and probably while Congress will continue to remain important, I kind of doubt that we're going to see Congress kind of swooping in and, taking this issue away from states in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I don't really see like those folks in Congress like really like jumping up and saying, yes, we want to debate abortion and take on this very controversial subject. They don't really strike me as a lot of courageous folks.
Yeah, and especially now, right? I mean, I think the common wisdom after the election is even more that way, I think.
I guess this is a funny question to ask you, being that you're not like quote, quote, pro-life or anti-abortion. I guess I should say anti-abortion. I need to be fair on my terms. But what would be your advice for anti-abortion young people? Or like, what's the like thing that as you're researching, the abortion movement, you just wish that the people on the other side would understand? Because I mean, I often get like, I don't know, from one of the reasons I love your work and the history that you make sure it gets told is that, the assumption is that the pro-life movement is really being led by a bunch of men in America, and that all of us who lead pro-life organizations are women, and we're just puppets for the men on our board. And it is like the most frustrating thing. I read like a book that the NARAL president wrote, and like that was like the whole premise, that we are just like repressed women and we're just subservient to the men on our board. And it's really these men on our boards that dominate the whole discussion. I'm like, do you realize like how like little I talk to my board? Like I subscribe as less is more is the thing. But like I'm like, that's one of the things I'm like, I really wish those who are pro-abortion would understand is like, no, really, we're women and like, we're like running the show. And we're not just subservient to the men in our lives. I think sometimes we do this work counter to the men in our lives who tell us, why are you traveling again and you're not home with your family? But what, like, do you have any advice like that or thoughts for pro-lifers?
I mean, I think with understanding people you disagree with, it's always helpful. Like, I think probably the most important thing is that I think when I talk about either movement, neither movement is homogenous, right? And so there can be differences along kind of racial lines, class lines, age, and so I think if you're talking to, like, if you're a young person who's a pro-lifer and you know someone in your life with whom you disagree, I think the most important thing is to not make assumptions about what that person thinks and actually ask them. Because while, it may be true at like an organizational level that like, a group like NARAL will have talking points and will have an agenda, like an individual person is not necessarily going to be that way. And also I think one thing that's been really helpful to me in my research is that, people come to their beliefs in lots of different ways, right? And sometimes there's a story. And so I think like anything else, it helps to start those conversations like with empathy, not sympathy, right? Like you have to agree with the person, but at least trying to understand where they're coming from and realize that people, as much as, and I really try to push this with people who are opposed to abortion too, that like, no movement is a monolith, right? People are going to disagree with each other. They're going to come to the movement for different reasons. They're going to have different goals they want to pursue as part of the movement. And I think that's true of the movements. And I think it's also true of people who don't agree or with whatever you're doing who aren't part of a movement, right? There are lots of people who, especially right now, given that Roe was just overturned, who are talking and thinking a lot about abortion, I would definitely not identify as, like activists, right? So I think not making assumptions is always a good idea. And I think it makes you a more effective advocate too. As a law professor, I always teach my students, like if you're arguing with a straw man, right? If you kind of caricature what someone you're disagreeing with is saying, the people who are in the middle, who don't know what to think, are not going to listen to you because they're going to say, well, that's not what that person is actually saying. Like I heard them. That's not what they're saying. So I think the more you listen, the better you are as an advocate too, because you're actually able to kind of report on the most effective argument that the person with whom you disagree is making, rather than kind of like a silly kind of dumbed down version of it.
Yeah, that's so great. And that's very sage advice. Thank you for that, Mary. I think it's very important. When we're having conversations about abortion with our friends, with our family members, with our peers, our professors, that, we're humanizing the preborn child in their eyes, but we also have to make sure we remember they are also human too. And everybody, we know, and this is one of our first lessons that we tell so many folks when we're training them on campuses, that everyone has a story. And as a pro-life advocate, you're going to hear a lot of stories when you're on campus. As soon as you raise your hand, as soon as you wear a pro-life t-shirt, as soon as you put a pro-life sticker on your laptop, you're going to start to hear folks' stories. And so you have to be ready to listen to those stories. Mary, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your perspective and wisdom. It is so great to have a conversation with you. Where can folks, besides like waiting for your quotes in newspaper articles about abortion, where can folks read more of articles or books that you have written about chronicling the history of the pro-life movement?
Sure. Yeah. So I've written 5 books. One of them with Routledge is sort of like supposed to be like an undergraduate seminar book. So that's maybe a good starting point. I've written, you can read any of the books. You can get excerpts of them free on, Google Books if people want to start there. A lot of them are also available in audiobook for people who like to listen to books, like while they drive or go running. And you can follow me on Twitter at Mary R. Ziegler. I'm not a huge Twitter user, but I do tweet about developments in the abortion debate. And I write fairly often, write op-eds too, largely again about kind of what's going on in places like the New York Times and CNN and the Atlantic. Although, in terms of finding quotes, like I talk to reporters from, everywhere. Like I was just talking to someone from the Washington Times today. So I will talk, I don't just talk to, well, I'm sure people listening to this are like, that's all the kind of, liberal media. So I talk to conservative media too. So you can find quotes from, in all kinds of places. But yeah, and I would say for people who are interested in the history, to check out the Harvard exhibit too, because you'll find, I think both, generally history there are no heroes and villains in history. There's a lot of kind of sympathetic characters in the middle. And I think that's a good reminder of whatever somebody thinks about this issue.
That's absolutely right. And history is so important. Now in the fall of Roe, I have been reading civil rights books, women's suffrage books nonstop. Like that is what I'm reading, because there is no playbook for where we go next in the pro-life movement. It's not like there was like this grand strategy. It's like, okay, as soon as Roe falls, we have a rough idea, but I can't control, sadly, I know what you all think, maybe I control everything. I don't control everything. And so we have to react to what the environment is. And so it's a constant reading of our history. And history, guys, is so important, because as the saying is so true. Those who fail to know their history are doomed to repeat it. And we cannot let the terrible wrongs of abortion continue. So thank you all for tuning in today to Explicitly Pro-Life. Make sure you share this episode with family and friends, and we'll be back with you next week.